Hey guys, this is Mr. Arvites here. This is lesson 1 of the coronavirus holiday for students. And this is an AP World History lesson. We're going to be talking about the isms of the 1800s in Europe. That's conservatism, liberalism, nationalism, romanticism, and pragmatism. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking who aren't in my class, if you're watching this. You might be thinking, hey, what does this have to do with world history? Because a lot of times AP World generally deals with things outside of Europe. However, I'll point this out. These isms, specifically liberalism and nationalism, play a large part in the entire world. And it also is something that you can always use for a contextual point on your exam. And let's face it, those contextual points are so very important. It's honestly the easy point you should always get on your essays in AP. So without further ado, we're going to get started on the lesson. All right, guys, we're going to talk about conservatism. But before we do, let's put into context what happened in Europe prior to this. So, you're talking the post-Napoleonic Europe. So Europe was taken over by Napoleon in France in the early 1800s. And when Napoleon took over Europe, one of the things that he did was he kind of brought liberalism and nationalism to these foreign countries. Whether or not it was on purpose or genuine or not is subject to debate. But the reality is Napoleon basically got rid of local noble privilege. He disbanded feudalism, and he brought in quote-unquote elections. And now we do know a lot of these elections were rigged, and they were with people Napoleon wanted to win. But still, the people saw that. And so when Napoleon left in 1815, after losing this series of battles, obviously, then his comeback tour, then losing again, right? Battle of Nations, and then the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon his message stayed. And so the young people in Europe began to ask for things like voting rights, began to ask for things that Napoleon had kind of preached. And in places like Germany and Italy, that whole idea of a national identity started to really buy in. Because remember, at this point in history, Germany and Italy are not like unified countries at all, right? These places have multiple city-states. Germany is a whole conglomerate of city-states. Italy has a little less, but still multiple city-states. In fact, you have German city-states that are controlled by Austria, some controlled by France. You have Italian city-states controlled by Austria and France as well. You have the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which kind of has relations with Austria and Spain. And so you have like various degrees of control going on throughout Central Europe. And I think it's important to recognize that this is going to be kind of the changing point for all this. Now, conservatism is really important. Conservatives wanted to go back to the way things were before Napoleon. And so some of the tactics they use in Europe are not very good. And largely Austria is the one kind of responsible for conservatism and its rise or lack thereof during this time period. You see, so when Napoleon surrendered, they had the Congress of Vienna, right, in 1814, 1815. And that Congress of Vienna tried to institute the old order. They tried to bring back everything in Europe that was once there. And so part of the stuff they brought back were nobles. They tried to institute feudalism in a variety of different places. But the world was changing. You remember, by 1815, we're also starting to build into the industrial economy. The Industrial Revolution has already started in England. You could argue that Napoleon sort of got it going in France, but really industrial economy kind of happens a little later in France, 1820s, 1830s. So we're seeing more industrialization. We're also seeing farming practices get to the point to where we see enclosure laws that have kicked people out of their homes, and so we have more and more people living in cities. And so as all of these people gathered in cities, and you still had nobles wanting to exert privilege and wanting to go back to the way things were, small revolutions happened. Now, I'm not going to talk about every single revolution that happened in Europe in the mid to early 1800s because it's absolutely absurd. But there is one you need to know, and that is the revolutions, plural, right, of 1848. And that's the one that's going to be in your AP review book, right? If you do like crash course AP World History, though I don't think you can get the modern one. There's only the regular one. It's in there, right? Or if you use the Princeton Review, it's in there. So the revolutions of 1848 are the big ones. So what is this conservatism? Well, conservatism tended to be anti-nationalism. It was the Austrians' kind of big playbook. And what they really wanted was to restore the old way. Now, liberals, on the other hand, right? Now, don't think of this as like conservative and liberals today. All right, liberalism, the big liberal agenda in the mid to early 1800s is voting rights. Now, by the way, liberals do have a serious flaw because they do not include women in a lot of these voting right pushes. And as we know in the French Revolution, they did give women rights at first, and then they stripped them away throughout the Reign of Terror in the 1890s. So voting rights was a big liberal type ideal, right? They wanted voting rights, they wanted representative-based government, they wanted fair trial, they wanted an erasing of noble privilege, right? That's kind of the big liberal staples. Now, that's going to change as we go forward, because as we go forward in history, we're going to see the Industrial Revolution, and some of these things become more centered on labor, okay? So liberals want voting rights, they want a destruction of that social hierarchy with feudalism and everything else. They don't want to return to feudalism at all. That's one thing that they're very against. And they want to form republics. They really want representative-based governments. Now, conservatives still want to preserve those monarchies. Remember, you had absolute monarchies in Spain. You had absolute monarchies in Austria, and they wanted to preserve that. You know, the Russians were so kind of aggravated when soldiers came back from France, right, in the 1820s in Russia. They shot some of these soldiers because they protested over not having any say-so in their government. So, you know, that's something to kind of think about. Now, nationalism. The question is, what is nationalism? Now, nationalism is kind of easy to define. And really, it's centered in Europe around language at this time. So nationalism most likely centered around language. And so when Napoleon would take over these places, some of the political leaders that would get appointed were like, well, what was the difference between, you know, Napoleon and Prussia? And, you know, Napoleon was very blunt with this, and he would say, look, you know, when I took over Prussia, I took over just Prussia. I didn't take over all of Germany. If all of you guys fought together, that would make things a lot harder. And so that got the wheels kind of rolling in Germany and in Italy, because as Napoleon took over these places, that's one of the things they had to deal with, was that they're taken over by this unified French army, and what do they have to show for it? And the answer was kind of nothing. And so nationalism comes by having a national identity. Now, that could also be an ethnic national identity, but generally speaking, and there are no absolutes in history, guys. There are no absolutes. Generally speaking, nationalism comes along with language. Okay? So the French nationalism is because they're all French. What do they have all together? They're French. And so when the Germans start to unify, what do we all have in common? We're German. Because you got to think about it. The Prussians were way different from the Bavarians and way different from the people in Western Germany as well. And so that is the one unifier that they get. The next ism that I like to talk about is romanticism. Romanticism is one of these things that we talk about in literature classes, but I think you can talk about it in a political sense too, because for conservatives, they romanticize the old rulers of the past. And in some countries, that didn't work out too well, right? Because in France, romanticizing the old kings, yeah, for the returning nobles, that sounded cool. But for everybody else who really hated monarchy, they got really mad about that, okay? And for the average person, they would romanticize Napoleon in the 1830s, which is why after 1848, you get another Napoleon, right? Napoleon III in charge of France. So romanticism is like a glorified look at the past. And so in artistic movements for romanticism, if this had graphics, which this one won't, but some of the ones later will, I would throw up some paintings where we have, you know, views of the past culture, you know, celebration of culture, right? So the French would celebrate all their cultures. We see a big celebration of Joan of Arc during this time period for France, and that's because obviously they're romanticizing the past about Joan of Arc. And so there's nothing wrong with that, and I think we do it all the time. I often say in the United States, we always romanticize things. You know, if you think about, you know, the 2016 election, you know, when Donald Trump ran for president, he said, "Make America great again." That was romanticism, right? That was saying, hey, this was so good in the past that we need to make it like this again. Now, we could have arguments all day over whether or not that's valid or that's a valid argument, but that's just the way it is. And for Europeans, it was the same type of mindset, right? So we're going to make, you know, say Spain, right? We're going to make it to where it was. And for the average person, that meant feudalism, right? That meant a lack of rights. And so some of them who even fought in those guerrilla wars against Napoleon are thinking, we got the raw end of the deal here, because really we should have rights. We're the ones who fought, right? In Spain, it was the average person who fights a guerrilla war, who kind of really stifles Napoleon in Spain. And that was the turning of the tide in that part of Europe. So just something to kind of think about. Romanticism comes in there because, you know, when we talk about leaders, particularly in France, romanticism is how Napoleon kind of gets put in charge. And Napoleon III, by and large, almost every decision he makes is through romanticism. And so let's look at another ism, right? Pragmatism, right? Pragmatism, Pragmatism. Pragmatism is immensely important because to understand Camille Cavois And to understand Otto von Bismarck, who's probably one of my personal favorite guys in history, you have to understand they are pragmatic. And what it means to be pragmatic is when your political ideology, while it does influence your decisions, you go away from that to solve problems. Right? Pragmatists are problem solvers. Okay, so when a problem arises, it doesn't matter if you're conservative or liberal, you're going to fix that problem with that. An example of this, Otto von Bismarck is one of the most conservative politicians in Germany. But one of the things that he does is he institutes public health care in Germany. He institutes old age pensions in Germany. He did these things not because he believed in them, but because he knew it would get the people on his side. It was a pragmatic decision. Pragmatist and realpolitik is the other term that you see in Euro a lot, not necessarily in world. These pragmatists also use war for a political advantage. The war doesn't have to be justified. It doesn't have to be morally okay, but they use it to achieve a political goal. And for the goals of Cavour and Bismarck, those goals were unification. Okay, and so that's what we're looking at when we talk about these isms kind of going forward. Now, as we kind of go into a different direction, we have to kind of understand where some people were. There's one name I think you should know. And that is Clemens von Metternich, Metternicch, Metternich. He's an Austrian, right? He's an Austrian noble who kind of heads up the Congress of Vienna. And he really tries to institute the conservative order on Europe. And so how do they do these things? Well, in places like Germany, they ban the teaching of liberalism. They ban the teaching of nationalism. And they even execute teachers in the 1820s who were teaching it at colleges. College professors, by the way, get hit up really hard by this because there is a massive pushback over this. And Clemens von Metternich is all about that. Now, to understand von Metternich, we have to understand a couple different things. One, this guy kind of runs Austria, right? While the king is there, Metternich is the politician who kind of controls everything. Really, from 1822 to 1848, he is the guy running Austria. Highly conservative. He practiced censorship. He did not like the reforms going on, the liberal reforms that took place. So, I think it's really important to kind of understand who this guy is. Metternich is also one of the most important guys when we, look at Europe as a whole, because he really tried to shape Europe in an image that would benefit Austria. Everything he does is to benefit Austria. And we should understand that too about the Congress of Vienna. These countries are trying to benefit themselves. People ask, what did Britain want? Britain just wanted trade. They wanted to be able to trade with these guys. They wanted to maintain the political order, right? And so Metternich wanted to do that as well. Austria, in my classes, we kind of laugh at Austria because Austria is always like the little state that could. It's powerful, but at the same token, it seems to always be at the losing end of these powerful things. And so that's something to kind of consider as you go forward, is that Austria is trying to maintain control in an old order, but really it doesn't have the power it once did. Now, it does conquer a lot of the territories in Eastern Europe, a lot during this time period. And obviously that does lead to World War I. But it's something to kind of consider when you look at Austria, that they are not the most powerful country militarily, but they do control. They control a lot of southern Germany, and as well as some other city-states as well. And that's kind of part of their deal. And Metternich is fighting to maintain that just over and over and over again. And that's his big play politically. So these isms, what do? Well, they really culminate in the Revolution of 1848. And the Revolution of 1848 isn't just about the isms, okay? It's about the Industrial Revolution. And so when Europe industrialized, and I already did my section on that for my classes, so sorry, I'm probably not going to make a video on the Industrial Revolution, though I still might, just to refresh them. The Industrial Revolution changed Europe fundamentally, right? More people were in cities. These cities expanded at an exponential rate, doubling, tripling in size over 20 years. There simply wasn't enough resources. So actually, people were living poorer lives during the early Industrial Revolution than they were prior. The other thing that the Industrial Revolution started to do is it really started to kill some specialists, right? And we talked about this in my classes. It started to kill people who made shoes, who made clothing, right? Things that could be replicated in a factory for cheaper and faster. They got kind of put out of business. And so you had people who for generations were middle-class citizens who are now poor. And that's a big deal. And that's part of the reason why the 1848 revolution occurs. The other part is that these European states, which had fought against revolutions basically since Napoleon left, they have revolutions in 1817, 1820, 1822, 1826, 1828, 1832, some big ones, 1836, 1838, and then 1848 is the ultimate big one. The workers started to really unite in a lot of ways. You also saw the other ism that I think we get into is socialism / communism, right? Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto, and it is not a coincidence that that book is shipped throughout Europe in 1848 and the revolutions happen in 1848. Now, for some of you who haven't read a textbook or haven't looked at a review book, these revolutions in 1848 happen in every major country outside of Britain. Okay, so Great Britain does not necessarily get impacted by these revolutions in 1848, but Austria does. Massive revolutions in Vienna, big revolutions in Prussia with Berlin, big revolutions in Hamburg. Paris has some massive ones, right? They're going to overturn the government in France again, right? And they're going to go on their next ruler, which is going to be Napoleon III, who promises a return, a romanticized return of the French Empire. So we get the Second French Empire is created off of this movement. We see revolutions take place in Spain. We see constitutional monarchy start to form, right? The revolutions of 1848 change Austria, right? We get that dual monarchy thing kind of comes around. Or at least the beginnings of it. It's not fully established, but we also get changes everywhere. The one place that's really resistant to this is Russia. While Russia does see some of these things, Russia had the tightest grip, the absolute tightest grip on censorship. And so their people are censored probably more so than other people. And Russia also is not industrialized. And so that revolution doesn't take place in Russia because of a lack of industrialization. And so I think that's very, very important. Now, what does 1848 do? Well, it eliminates that Congress of Vienna. It eliminates the concert of Europe. And so Europe now becomes a little bit of a free-for-all when it comes to countries. And we see more rivalries kind of pick up. We also see places like Prussia reform some of their parts. We see France start to reform, and they learn from Britain, because the way Britain avoided these things is Britain gradually gave people rights. And you should have learned about this in the Industrial Revolution, was they gradually gave their citizens rights, more and more voting rights over time. Like really every decade we see a series of reforms. 1832 is the one that really comes to mind. But they give a lot of reforms where they give equal representation in court, and they open up the House of Commons. They allow male citizens to vote, not all, but most. And so we start to see that kind of developing as well. So what are these isms going to lead to? That becomes the big question, okay? So what we're going to see is after the 1848 elections, we're going to see a lot of consolidation of power, okay? And we're going to see varying degrees of people. Now, in Austria, because they've conquered so many places, and they will continue to conquer places in Central Europe as part of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, we see revolts break up. The Hungarians want representation. They want their own monarchy. They want their own government. But we see that take place when they take over Serbia and everything else. Greece becomes independent largely because of a nationalistic movement and funding from Britain as well. In France, we see some representation go on with Napoleon's government. We see parliamentary fixtures get put up in virtually every European country has to have some sort of parliamentary doctrine. And now these parliaments aren't always effective, but they're there, okay? Now, in Germany, there's a young man named Otto von Bismarck in 1848. Now, Otto von Bismarck is going to kind of look at this as a failed revolution, and he says, wait a second, this is not how you unify a country. You unify them, and they're going to have the blood and iron policy, which we'll talk about in a later video. Otto von Bismarck is by far one of my favorite characters throughout world history. In fact, I actually think I already have a PowerPoint up about Otto von Bismarck that you can check out if you just follow the links through my channel. I posted it last year, I think, when I was in D.C. So you're going to see Otto von Bismarck kind of come up. Camillo Cavour, we see the Italian unification start to arise up really as early as the 1853, 1854. And then the last major event is going to be the Crimean War. Okay? The Crimean War is the first major war between European countries and a non-European country in the mid-1800s. It's the first major war since Napoleon was defeated. And it starts off between the Ottoman Empire and the Russians. And yes, the Russians were after Crimea in the 1800s, just like they did to the Ukraine recently. And this war was between these countries, right? And so Great Britain and France, because Russia was perceived as the powerful country in Europe, because they kind of stopped Napoleon, Great Britain and France are going to kind of team up and give the Ottomans a lot of weapons, a lot of money, and people, and they're going to go into that war. Now, I'll give you a little, spoiler for the Italian unification. the Italians, specifically the Kingdom of Sardinia, is going to give soldiers to the British and French cause. And they do this not because it makes a difference, but because it politically makes a statement. And that's where their unification is going to begin with the help of France and everything else. They also know the leader of France, Napoleon III, is romantic and he loves these gestures, and he'll help them against the Austrians, who are remaining neutral. So the Austrians remain neutral in this war, which basically makes enemies out of everyone in Europe. So that's the isms, right? Conservatism, romanticism, liberalism, pragmatism. These things are really, really important going forward. And look, like I said, most likely you're going to use them as context on an essay. I know for my guys writing in a couple of days on the unifications of Italy and Germany, that's what they're going to be using for context. So thank you for watching. Stick with it, because we're going to have videos pretty much every day to kind of get through this coronavirus holiday. So keep watching, and I will talk to you next time.